Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Valentine's Day, and welcome to the Congressional Briefing and National Webinar, PRGLAC Then and Now, Where We Are and Where We're Going, the final installment of a three-part series hosted by the Coalition to Advance Maternal Therapeutics. My name is Lindsay Horan, and I'm the Chief Advocacy Officer at SWHR. Our Society for Women's Health Research. SWHR is a more than 30-year-old national nonprofit dedicated to promoting sex differences in disease and improving women's health through science, policy, and education. Additionally, and notable for today's event, we are the administrative home of the Coalition to Advance Maternal Therapeutics. Before we move into today's program, I wanted to review just a few details and housekeeping notes. So first, we would like to thank the Coalition's corporate members whose support has made this briefing series possible: Biogen, Covis Pharma, Janssen, and UCB. Please note that today's web event is being recorded and will be posted online following the event. We'll also be sending out the recording and any of the resources mentioned in the follow-up email to our registrants. To ask a question to the panelists at any point during today's webinar, please use the Zoom Q&A function. Alternatively, you can use the chat function, and we'll be sure to ask your questions at the end of the event following all panelists' presentations. So as I mentioned, today's event is being hosted by SWHR in our capacity as administrative home for the Coalition to Advance Maternal Therapeutics. The coalition was founded in 2014 by a group of organizations who recognized the tremendous need to understand the effects of drugs on a woman and her pregnancy and the ways in which pregnancy may alter the uptake, metabolism, and effect of medication. Over the years, the members of this coalition have really sought to raise awareness among policymakers and among industry about the need to include pregnant and lactating women in clinical trials, to close our gaps in knowledge, and ultimately to improve the health of women and their families. As part of its work, the coalition successfully advocated for the creation of the Task Force on Research Specific to Pregnant Women and Lactating Women, or PRGLAC, as you'll hear it referred to today, which is what brings us here. PRGLAC was established as part of the 21st Century Cures Act, and its charge was to provide advice and guidance to the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services on activities related to identifying and addressing gaps in knowledge and research on safe and effective therapies for pregnant and lactating women. The task force's work culminated in a 2018 report that highlighted a set of 15 recommendations. And really, the central theme of these recommendations was the fundamental need for us to change the culture surrounding the inclusion of pregnant and lactating women in research. So within the report, the authors noted the imperative to emphasize the importance and the public health significance of building a knowledge base to inform medical decision-making for these populations, which had been severely lacking in decades prior. The recommendations identified within the report cut across multiple areas of the research enterprise, and they also included some proposed tactics on how to achieve these certain goals. So some of the things that were included within the recommendations included a call for the inclusion of pregnant and lactating women to be incorporated into a clinical research agenda, which would involve actions like removing pregnant women as a vulnerable population in research, increasing research on the safety and efficacy of therapeutic products used by pregnant and lactating women, and expanding the workforce of clinicians and research investigators with expertise in these areas. And then certainly removing certain regulatory barriers for this population's participation in research. So that's just to name a few, but like I said, there are 15 recommendations in total, and we can drop in the chat the link to the recommendations report. So during today's webinar, we'll hear from some of our esteemed colleagues at U.S. research and public health agencies about how their agencies are working toward a culture of inclusion for pregnant and lactating women in research, and what opportunities and challenges they've faced in implementing this work. So with that, I would like to introduce the panelists for today's event. We are thrilled to be joined by Drs. Bianchi, Rafehouse, and Vashisht. So Dr. Diana Bianchi is the director of the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, where she oversees NICHD's mission to lead research and training to understand human development improve reproductive health, enhance the lives of children and adolescents, and optimize abilities for all. Dr. Bianchi's research focuses on prenatal genomics with the goal of advancing non-invasive prenatal DNA screening and diagnosis to develop new therapies for genetic disorders that can be administered prenatally. Dr. Yanida Rafehouse is the branch chief for the Birth Defects Monitoring and Research Branch and CDC's Division of Birth Defects and Infant Disorders, where she oversees birth defect surveillance and research activities to identify causes of birth defects, find opportunities to prevent them, and improve the health of those living with birth defects. She's published numerous scientific papers on this topic, including on fertility treatments, antidepressants, antibiotics, ADHD medications, Zika, HIV, and others. And then last but not least, Dr. Kavita Vashisht is the Associate Commissioner for Women's Health at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, where she's responsible for directing the Office of Women's Health. Under her leadership, the office works to advance the health of women through scientific programs, policy development, research, education, and outreach. Prior to joining the Office of Women's Health, Dr. Vashisht served as the Deputy Director for the Division of Clinical Trial Quality in the Office of Medical Policy in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. So before I officially turn the floor over to Dr. Bianchi, I would like to share a recording that we received for this event with remarks from Representative Kathy Castor. Representative Castor was elected to Congress in 2006 and represents Florida's 14th congressional district. She has been a true champion surrounding legislative efforts to promote the inclusion of pregnant and lactating populations in research. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Representative Castor.
Hi, I'm Congresswoman Kathy Castor. Thank you so much for inviting me to offer greetings for this important briefing. I commend the Society for Women's Health and Research on your efforts to expand research on pregnant and lactating people. You have been supportive and a committed partner over the years and integral to the congressional efforts to support pregnant and lactating people. Each year in the United States, nearly 4 million people give birth and more than 3 million initiate breastfeeding. Despite how common it is, there's very little information on the safety of therapeutics and vaccines in pregnancy, and even less on the safety for the baby when breastfeeding. We saw this failure most recently with the COVID-19 vaccine, where pregnant people originally were told to forego the protection of the vaccine. I was proud to lead the Safe Medications for Moms and Babies Act in 2016 with women and lactating women, PRGLAC. They released a report with 15 recommendations in 2018 and a detailed implementation plan in 2020. While we certainly have made advances in including more pregnant and lactating people in clinical research, we have a long way to go. Shortly, I will be introducing the bipartisan Advancing Safe Medications for Moms and Babies Act, which will bring FDA in line with the rest of HHS by removing pregnant women as a vulnerable research population. We'll establish a national clearinghouse of information on registries and clinical trials. We'll create a committee on research specific to pregnant and lactating women to coordinate federal activities and to address research gaps. It will also raise awareness through an educational campaign and also direct the NIH to prioritize research on medications for this population. For those in the audience, please encourage your member of Congress to join our bill and support our efforts to protect the health of women, parents, and children. Thanks again to SWHR for inviting me here today, and please enjoy the briefing.
So thank you again to Representative Castor for joining us and for her partnership. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Bianchi. Dr. Bianchi, to you.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, and thanks to the Society for Women's Health Research, as well as the Coalition for inviting us. And I'm honored to be here with my esteemed colleagues from the CDC and the FDA, both of whom have been active in both the PRGLAC task force and its implementation of the recommendations. Next slide, please. So you've already heard from Lindsay that there were 15 recommendations. The link is at the bottom of the slide. We can't, with the time that we have, go over all of the recommendations, but this is sort of an overview of what I'm going to try to accomplish in my 10 to 12 minutes. I think the most important message is that we all aim to change the existing culture, in which the prevalent culture is that women who are pregnant should not take anything. That's the safest way to go. But we really don't know that that's the safest way to go. In fact, for many women with chronic conditions, the safest way would be for them to continue their medications. But we just can't reassure them that this is the right approach without the data. So the mantra is to protect pregnant people through research instead of from research. In my remarks today, I'm going to cover some recent research programs that have been funded as a result of our deep commitment to the recommendations that were made by the PRGLAC task force. The high level is we're going to show how we're including pregnant and lactating people in clinical research. We're increasing research on the safety and efficacy of therapeutic products used by pregnant women and lactating women. And we are driving programs to look at discovery and development of therapeutics, not only to look at medications that are approved for non-pregnant people, but to develop new therapeutics. And importantly, part of the task force recommendations were to expand the workforce of clinicians and researchers with expertise in obstetric and lactation pharmacology and therapeutics. So let me show you what we have done. Next slide, please. So far, it's not completed. Next slide, please. So a big program that we have funded as a result, a direct result of the PRGLAC recommendations, is called the Imprint Hub. It's advancing frontiers in health through maternal and pediatric precision in therapeutics. It's envisioned as a national resource for expertise in maternal and pediatric therapeutics. It consists of a knowledge core and centers of excellence. And it really is meant to address the underrepresentation of both women and their infants and children in clinical trials. It's both a service center and a science catalyst. It enhances the availability of knowledge, regulatory science, and drug development tools. It catalyzes and accelerates maternal and pediatric therapeutics towards precision medicine, and it synergizes with other resources and networks. The goal is to facilitate safer, more inclusive, and more cost-effective trials for the populations that we are concerned with. Next slide, please. So there are currently 3 awards within the Imprint Centers of Excellence. There's one at the University of California, San Diego, which is specifically examining the effects of maternal antibiotics on breast milk and infant outcomes. Now, these studies have all started in the last couple of years, so we don't have a huge number of results yet, but some of the early findings indicate that there are many unexplored metabolites in human breast milk, and additional research is needed to better describe the activity of these metabolites to determine drug safety in infants. The second big program that we funded is at Vanderbilt, and that is looking at maternal and pediatric precision therapeutics using electronic health record phenotyping to validate pharmacogenomic associations. And as a first use case, they are applying this strategy to neonatal opioid withdrawal syndrome. And lastly, a number of other organizations. So there's a partnership between Indiana University and Ohio State University. They have the funding for the data hub and then the data coordination center. Next slide, please. I did want to share with you some very exciting results that were just presented last week at the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine meeting, and also was coordinated with a publication in the New England Journal of Medicine last Thursday. And that's the A+ study, which is actually fulfilling one of the recommendations. It's recommendation 10, which was to include pregnant people in clinical research. This was a research study that was co-funded by NICHD's Global Network for Women and Children's Research, as well as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the test was whether a single oral 2-gram dose of the very cost-effective antibiotic azithromycin could reduce postpartum sepsis and death. They enrolled more than 29,000 women in 7 low and middle income countries. They were given this antibiotic during labor, and an early interim analysis showed a clear maternal benefit with reduction of postpartum sepsis and death by 1/3. It so far has not been shown to reduce the risk of stillbirth, newborn sepsis, or newborn death, but I presume it will now translate to clinical care in these global populations because of the significant maternal benefit. So that's a study that really got started after PRGLAC and was definitely influenced and informed by PRGLAC. Next slide, please. We also heard recently from one of our NICHD grantees, Dr. Kevin Watt at the University of Utah, and he presented to us some of the results from the CUDDLE study, which I will describe in a moment. And he is also looking at ways to really be opportunistic. We know that new mothers have, first of all, they're sleep deprived, they've got many responsibilities, and participating in a research study may not be the first priority. So he is starting a unique home collection study where they are collecting breast milk at home versus breast milk under rigorous study collection conditions. And they're also checking to see whether they can collect and then mail samples to the clinic. Now, the CUDDLE study is taking advantage of postpartum women who are either visiting their premature newborns in the hospital or who are coming back for clinic visits for their own health. And they are on medications for their own health. And in this study, the participants are giving a sample of breast milk, they're giving blood samples, and their baby is also giving a very small heel prick type of blood sample. Next slide. So CUDDLE is an acronym for commonly used drugs during lactation and infant exposure. The primary objective is to determine drug concentrations in maternal plasma, breast milk, and infant plasma. So you need the data to be able to say that the infant is being exposed to a very high level of drug that might be harmful. They have created several lists now of drugs that are high priority drugs to study. They've been selected for a knowledge gap, how frequently it's used by postpartum women, or the potential to harm the infant. For the study, the mother is already taking the drug, and as I said, it's opportunistic. So the study is aligned with hospital visits that are occurring anyway, and they are studying 50 women per drug. Then there's so that's for the pharmacokinetics part. There's also the safety part, examining the safety of commonly used drugs. And how much exposure does the baby get in the breast milk? And they're also looking at some other exploratory objectives. And they are also collaborating with other major networks that are funded by NICHD, for example, the Maternal Fetal Medicine Units Network. Next slide, please. So another resource that, so can we just go back one moment? I did want to mention that Dr. Wall presented to us last week, Dr. Watt presented to us last week some of the very early data on 3 drugs that they've tested, including oxycodone, nifedipine, and ondansetron. And he showed very compelling data that while there were differences between the drugs in how much they concentrated in breast milk, in none of those 3 drugs was there any concentration anywhere near what a baby would normally get if the baby were given the drug. So the bottom line for those 3 drugs is the baby essentially is not exposed through breast milk. And that's a very important message. And Kavita, those data are going over to the FDA for examination regarding labeling. But it's these kinds of studies that are crucial and that we intend to fund so that we can provide the data so that providers or pregnant or postpartum people do not have to make decisions based on an absence of data. Next slide, please. Another resource that I wanted to mention, because recommendation 12 said that we need to use existing resources. And for many years, we have funded something called the Data and Specimen Hub, which is a centralized resource for researchers to share de-identified data from studies that have been funded and have been ongoing from NICHD. And it's a portal for requesting biospecimens for these selected studies. And it's been hugely successful. You can see here that there have been 581 data requests, for example. It's a great resource because you don't need to do anything related to the IRB. You can have a hypothesis, you can test the hypothesis, you can get your biospecimens. And I highlighted in red that some of the studies directly deal with pharmacology, and some actually have both blood and breast milk specimens available from blood from mother and baby. Next slide, please. I also mentioned that we are very concerned about the workforce, and part of the MPrint project is to fund an expert hub webinar series. We also fund the NICHD's obstetric and pediatric pharmacology and therapeutics branch, pediatric clinical and developmental pharmacology training network. And we know from graduates of those programs that many of those fellows are taking jobs in the pharmaceutical sector. We also fund research education program grants to enhance workforce training in areas that include inclusion and retention of pregnant and lactating persons in clinical research. Again, addressing that culture change that we need to include pregnant and lactating persons. We've got a variety of training and career development awards, and we are currently working on a strategic plan for the NIH Clinical Center, which was initially focused on children, but it has come up in the course of the discussion how important it would be to have an opportunity to have a research lactation laboratory where we could study pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, exactly the way the Cuddle study is doing it, but doing it at the clinical center. And that has been discussed and viewed favorably by our task force for the strategic plan. Next slide, please. So in the future, what's ahead? Next slide. Representative Castor referred to the whole situation with a lack of pregnant people being included in vaccine research testing. That can't happen again. We had all of the recommendations available. Again, by changing the culture, we want people who are developing vaccines and therapeutics to think of pregnant people as a crucial population to include in preclinical testing. And, you know, all it's really going to take is a mindset that would include pregnant animal models, for example, or getting information on people who are already on medications who could contribute to research. We had all of those recommendations available, and yet when it came time to administer the first wave of COVID-19 vaccines, pregnant people and their providers were left to their own devices. So next slide. There were a few other recommendations that our organization, NICHD, has not addressed because it's not really in our purview, but we thought it would be important from our perspective to just mention those today. And one is to create a public awareness campaign to engage the public and healthcare providers in research on pregnant women and lactating women. And you'll notice I do use women and people interchangeably. The authorization language used women, but we do use people interchangeably to be more inclusive. Another recommendation was to develop and implement evidence-based communication strategies with healthcare providers on information relevant to research on pregnant women and lactating women. And lastly, to develop separate programs to study therapeutic products used off patent in pregnant women and lactating women using the NIH Best Pharmaceuticals in Children's Act program as a model. So that's the end of my remarks. I'm going to hand it over to, I think Yanita will be the next colleague to go. So thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for to the okay, let me start over because I thought I was going to be last. So my apologies.
I can skip, I can rotate with you because I was supposed to go second. Let me know whatever you want to
Okay,
do.
let's stick with our order and you go next, Kavita.
I'm sorry, I messed it up. My apologies.
All good. Hi, everybody. So I'm gonna, give me a second to share my screen here with you all. Are you seeing a blue screen right now? And my first slide?
Yes, we are.
Okay, excellent. Well, again, I also echo what Diana said. Thank you so much for having me on this panel, CAMT, SWHR, and of course, being with my colleagues who I love engaging with. My disclaimers. So I wanted to begin by talking a little bit about the Office of Women's Health. You heard in the intro that I direct this office, and I thought it'd be important to sort of set the stage of where we sit within the FDA, which is a huge organization. So the mission of our office is really to promote the inclusion of women in clinical trials and the implementation of guidelines concerning the representation of women in clinical trials and the completion of appropriate data analyses. Now, we also work to identify and monitor the progress of cross-cutting and multidisciplinary women's health initiatives. This includes changing needs, anything that can really impact the health of women. And we also serve as a principal advisor to the commissioner and other agency colleagues on scientific, ethical, and policy matters. We do not work in making the regulatory decisions around products. Those decisions are actually done within our medical product centers. So in alignment with the mission that I just mentioned, we served as the FDA's representative on the task force on research specific to pregnant and lactating women. Maternal health is a very important focus area, not just to the Office of Women's Health, but really across FDA. So to get the perspective of all of our colleagues, we created an internal FDA working group. And this included representation from our product centers, as well as other offices, to provide a multidisciplinary and comprehensive perspective from FDA to inform the work of the task force, which included the initial report that came out in 2018 and the follow-up implementation plan recommendations, which were published about 2 years ago. And on the circles on the slides, you can see all the different centers and offices that we work with towards this effort. So in addition to the work on the task force, there are several activities and initiatives across FDA to really support our public health mission related to pregnancy and lactation. And this includes efforts to advance policy, research, outreach, and education. And today I'm going to present a few of those select FDA activities that are relevant to PRGLAC. So recommendation 1, ask the Food and Drug Administration to harmonize with the common rule and remove pregnant women as a vulnerable population. In September of 2022, FDA published a proposed rule that would harmonize certain provisions of our informed consent and IRB regulations with the HHS common rule. So for example, in this rule, we propose to adapt the common rule language regarding the categories of participants who are considered vulnerable to coercion or undue influence. So this change, if finalized as proposed, would remove pregnant women from the vulnerable population category. So at this time, we are reviewing and analyzing the public comments that came back for this proposed rule. In addition to this, in November of 2020, the FDA issued a final guidance for industry on enhancing the diversity of clinical trial populations. Now, this guidance recommends approaches that sponsors can utilize really to broaden eligibility criteria, to expand inclusive trial practices, trial designs, methodological approaches, and it also mentions considering including PK to establish dosing in women who become pregnant during a trial when it's possible for their continued participation. In addition to that final guidance, many of you may be aware of 3 FDA guidances that came out, I think, between 2018 and 2020 in draft. I have them here on this slide. I think what it shows is that we really are committed to advancing research, advancing our understanding of therapeutics use in pregnancy and lactation. The first one talks about scientific and ethical considerations for inclusion in clinical trials. The second one talks about post-approval pregnancy studies. The third one, clinical lactation studies. And I also mentioned that we have a guidance that came out several years ago, but that talks about pharmacokinetics in pregnancy. And guidances are really a way for FDA to communicate our current thinking on a topic. The 3 guidances I mentioned, the FDA is reviewing the comments that it received on those draft guidances. In addition, the agency did respond to the COVID pandemic by issuing early in the pandemic guidance for industry regarding the development of drugs and biologic products for the treatment or prevention of COVID-19. These encourage the enrollment of pregnant and lactating individuals in phase 3 clinical trials when appropriate, as well as the guidance for industry on the development and licensure of vaccines to prevent COVID-19. That's the second one on the slide. And in this guidance, the agency encouraged vaccine developers to consider early in their development program data that might support the inclusion of pregnant women and women of childbearing potential who are not actively avoiding pregnancy. So in addition to the guidances and the regulatory efforts that I mentioned, I wanted to talk about more of an international effort, not more of an international effort. And when you look at recommendation 11, it talks about leveraging established and supporting new infrastructure and collaborations to perform research in pregnant women and lactating women. So just as recently as a few months ago in 2020, the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use, also known as ICH, endorsed the formation of an informal working group at this time to develop a concept paper to think about a framework to enable the inclusion or retention of pregnant and breastfeeding individuals in clinical trials where appropriate. So this is very exciting. It includes multiple stakeholders, including FDA, some of our international regulatory partners, industry. Recommendation 2 talks about increasing the quantity, quality, and timeliness of research on safety and efficacy of therapeutic products used by pregnant and lactating women. So in the next few slides, I'm going to just touch on, at a high level, some of our efforts in this space. A few years ago, our office established the FDA's Office of Women's Health Research Roadmap. And this was a first of its kind. It really incorporated cross-agency input to create a broad strategic direction for outlining priority areas to help maximize the impact of the research of our research initiatives and ultimately promote optimal health for all women. And on this slide, you can see that the priority areas were very broad. There were 7 priority areas. I'm not going to go into all of them, but they do range from improving health communications to expanding data sources and analysis to advancing biomarker science. So a very broad range of priority areas that we draw from. In the pregnancy and lactation space, we have quite a bit of research and a lot of collaborations. Not many people know that FDA has an intramural research program. We have researchers there who do wonderful research. And recently, we've also worked with our external partners through our Centers of Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation and our broad agency announcements, which has allowed us to further expand the portfolio of the type of research that we fund, including in pregnancy and lactation. This slide is really a high level. I think I included half here of some of our recent research in the last few years on pregnancy and lactation. And what I just want to point out here is that we are really trying to bridge gaps in knowledge by promoting diverse research. These projects range from surveys, looking at health communications, to in vitro, in vivo extrapolation of breast milk, looking at real world use of pharmaceuticals in pregnancy and lactation, addressing really emerging critical topics such as SARS-CoV-2, and then also looking at innovative ways to gather more information, such as machine learning, artificial intelligence, and then developing a pharmacokinetic type database. So we're excited about the research that we recently funded and look forward to seeing the results of these projects. I also wanted to mention an app. So our office recently funded the expansion of a program that FDA has developed with NCATS called Cure ID. And essentially, this is a mobile app that allows practitioners around the world who are using medications in different populations to input the information that they have about the use of those medications. So we're looking to find novel ways of using FDA-approved drugs to treat the infectious diseases, emerging threats, and we funded the part of the app that's going to be looking at infectious diseases and cancer and pregnancy. And we funded this recently during COVID, so we'll see what this brings. But again, really trying to expand our reach and use innovative ways to collect information and bridge important gaps in our knowledge. For the next few slides, I'm going to really touch upon a study that our office conducted in collaboration with WebMD. Studies have estimated overall prevalence of medication use in pregnancy, but there really is little research regarding patterns or changes in medication use, which is a critical component to understanding how pregnant individuals negotiate the benefits and risks. So our objective with this project was to describe medication use and how women who are pregnant assess medication safety, and then to quantify changes in and reasons for changes in medication use during pregnancy. So among the women who reported taking any medication during pregnancy, 42% in this study started a new medication, 35% stopped. You can see that 18% lowered a dose and 30% missed a dose of the medication. And what I wanted to mention here was that of the women who stopped, lowered, or missed medication, they were asked about the reasons for the change. And although a majority of pregnant individuals in our study, about 64%, stated they followed the advice of a healthcare provider, it's important to note that close to 35% made a medication change independent of that advice. And moreover, notable percentages of women reported stopping, lowering, or missing a dose due to concerns over safety. That's including that it could cause birth defects or developmental issues. So it's important that we explore strategies to help us learn more about medications that are used during pregnancy. Recommendation 13 talks about optimizing registries for pregnancy and lactation. Our office does provide a web page. It's user-friendly, and it does list approximately 150 registries for FDA-regulated medical products. Now, we don't conduct these studies. We provide this information as a resource to the community. I also want to mention our Perinatal Health Center of Excellence. FDA recognized the need for coordinated research to address public health needs during the perinatal period. This includes the health of the mother, premature infants and newborns, as well as development through childhood. And so to that end, FDA's National Center for Toxicologic Research established FDA's virtual perinatal health center of excellence to focus on these populations and really increase opportunities for collaborations, leveraging research opportunities, etc. So recommendation 6 talks about developing and implementing evidence-based communication strategies with healthcare providers on information relevant to research on pregnant and lactating individuals. So in the next few slides, I'm going to touch on some of the research, education efforts that we had. In order to bring a broader awareness to healthcare providers Just this past year, our office launched a new regulatory series where we collaborated with our colleagues in the Division of Pediatrics and Maternal Health to bring broader awareness to some of the FDA policies and resources that may increase knowledge and use of therapeutics in pregnancy and lactation. So the first webinar actually talked about the pregnancy and lactation labeling rule, also known as the PLLR. This replaced a previous approach that used letter categories. And the webinar was really aimed to help learners examine how the prescription drug label can be used to inform prescribing for pregnant and lactating individuals. And then more recently, we held a webinar on engaging providers to address knowledge gaps on medication use in pregnancy and lactation. And this webinar talked about our efforts in the research space, talked about the types of studies enrolling pregnant and lactating individuals, and also ways that healthcare providers could become involved in research. I had just mentioned our registry page, a very valuable resource. We also collaborate with stakeholders. Here's just a snapshot of some recent public workshops that were held by FDA, looking at very important topics relevant to our discussion today. There was one on pharmacokinetics, another one focused on the scientific and ethical considerations for including pregnant people in clinical trials. We had one on leveraging real-world data. And then we also had one on COVID-19 vaccines in women that our office conducted earlier in the pandemic. And really this was to dispel misinformation and to present the information that the agency had at that time to the public. And then FDA also provides a clinical investigator training course. This slide is outdated because there was actually one just recently as well. But I bring this up because this is a great resource and tool, and there are sections of this course that talk about special populations. We talk about sex differences, pregnant populations, pediatrics. So this may be something for those of you that are listening that you may be interested in. And now I'm just going to touch on a few communication efforts that we have. This slide actually lists publications, really a snapshot of publications from our office and other areas of the FDA. Another way we are communicating information externally. We also have a lot of very user-friendly resources, maybe 40 fact sheets that our office puts out in multiple languages. And here's a snapshot of those that pertain to pregnancy. And then another way we try to get the message out there is through social media. Here are some of our social media efforts to get people to understand that it's important for women to be in clinical trials and for pregnant women to be in clinical trials as well. So quickly to sum up some of my efforts, now the whole agency efforts here. So to sum up our efforts, there have been a lot of efforts put into policy. I mentioned the guidances coming out of our divisions, the efforts to harmonize with the common rule coming out of our Office of Clinical Policy and Programs, workshops and trainings across FDA, communication and outreach, and of course, collaboration with many of you, our stakeholders. Thank you very much. Off to you, Renetta.
Thank you so much. And my apologies for my earlier stumble. Let me share my screen. So my name is Jenita Reefhuis. I'm very honored to be speaking to you today. I, of course, want to add my thanks to the SWHR for hosting and inviting me to join today. Let's see. As you've heard from Dr. Bianchi, PRGLAC recommendations really aim to shift research from the approach of protecting women from research to protecting women through research. And CDC's role is really to complement the clinical research activities of our colleagues through surveillance and observational research. We focus on understanding what's happening in the real world. What medications are women taking, and how do they affect the health outcomes for them and for their infants? Do they have the same access to medications as their non-pregnant counterparts? And this is especially important in public health emergencies, as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic. there are three main areas where CDC is uniquely situated to contribute. CDC provides population-based data. One of CDC's strengths is supporting the monitoring of disease in a specific geographical area, often a state. This means that our data is not limited by whether you had a specific type of health insurance or went to a specific hospital or clinic. Also, we can provide information on the medication pregnant people actually took in some of our surveillance systems and case control studies. And we work to ensure that pregnant people and their infants are included and considered in public health emergencies. Our division uses different approaches to answer some of these critical questions. I want to highlight two of them during this presentation, but of course, there are additional programs at CDC that work towards achieving some of the goals of PRGLAC as well. To study pregnancy outcomes, it is not only important to look forward, so starting with exposures during pregnancy and then following the outcomes for the mother-infant dyad, but in order to be able to study outcomes such as birth defects that are relatively rare, it is also important to look back, starting with the infant or the outcome. CDC funds centers of excellence called the Centers for Birth Defects Research and Prevention. These centers work together on two case control studies. So looking back, births from 1997 through 2011 are included in the National Birth Defects Prevention Study, or NBDPS. And since 2014, we have been interviewing mothers for the birth defect study to evaluate pregnancy exposures, or BD steps. These studies start with population-based surveillance, representing all residents from that geographical area. Both study birth defects, and BD steps also includes pregnancies that ended in stillbirth. In these studies, we focus on risk factors that can be changed, including medications. So one relatively unique contribution is that we reach out to talk to all the women in the included counties or state who had a child with one of the birth defects we study. By talking with them, we can determine not only what prescription medication they took, when they started taking them, and if and when they stopped taking them, just like Dr. Kavish just mentioned that women stopped taking them, but we can also ask them about over-the-counter medications, vaccinations, and herbal treatments, which are not always included in medical records. And we can ask about other important factors, such as whether she smoked or traveled to an area where, for instance, Zika might be circulating. Here are two recent examples of papers where medication use trends during pregnancy are shown. On the left, you can see how ondansetron use increased from none to 7% in a period of 14 years. And on the right, you can see the use trends for a number of different antidepressants. Both of these graphs only show control participants to give a sense of the medication use in the general pregnant population. And I also wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of what kind of data we have published. So since July 2019, data from the NBDPS have been published on many medications used during pregnancy, including benzodiazepines, atypical antipsychotics, ADHD, and asthma medications. And you can see that the number of women we could include in our analyses vary by medications. So for antihistamines, we had more than 5,000 people who reported using that medication during pregnancy, while we only had 44 people who reported use of tricyclic antidepressants, and that's then over a really long period of time. That's 1997 through 2011. So some of this research takes a while. The second project I wanted to mention is SETNet, the Surveillance for Emerging Threats to Mothers and Babies network. SETNet funds state, local, and territorial health departments to work with CDC to identify the impact of emerging health threats, like COVID-19, hepatitis C, syphilis, and cytomegalovirus, on pregnant people and their infants. Funded jurisdictions collect information on pregnant women and their children up to age 3. Looking specifically at our COVID-19 work, SETNet and other pregnancy-related data have identified that pregnant people are at an increased risk for severe disease and death compared to non-pregnant people. It also established that COVID-19 during pregnancy increases the risk for adverse pregnancy outcomes, including preterm birth and stillbirth. And importantly, SETNet findings on the increased risk of COVID-19 during pregnancy have been critical to inform prioritization of pregnant people for COVID-19 vaccination. We know that pregnant people and their infants will continue to experience infectious diseases as well as other conditions because they are part of the population. So SETNet has great potential to become the national surveillance system for this subpopulation. So through accountability, collaboration within and across federal agencies, communications with our public health partners at state health departments and in healthcare settings, and by increasing the timeliness of our data and research, the PRGLAC recommendations provide a framework for us at CDC to move forward and protect pregnant women and their infants through research. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our panelists today. I will invite our panelists now to turn back on their cameras and their microphones for the Q&A piece. Again, we invite you to submit questions to our panelists using the Q&A function that's included below. You're also welcome to use the chat function if that's easier. So maybe to get us started, it's been so helpful to listen to what each of your respective agencies are doing in this space. And, thinking back to the PRGLAC report with the recommendations, there's obviously a great challenge when it comes to shifting this culture to the inclusion of pregnant and lactating women in research. I would love to just hear from each of you what you've found to be the greatest challenge as you've worked to improve the inclusion of these populations. Maybe should we go in the order that you all presented? So we'll start Dr. Bianchi, Dr. Vashis, Dr. Rayhouse.
I think that from within our institute and really across NIH, we did not have challenges. I think everybody recognized the importance of this endeavor. And there has been a tremendous amount of support from other institutes and centers, as well as NICHD. I think there's going to be a huge challenge in terms of translating data to practice. That's where I think there's going to that's where the rubber will hit the road, and there are going to be a lot of tacks in the road. But I think another challenge is, being able to scale up the kinds of studies that Dr. Watt is doing, and the Cuddle study and similar studies, where we will have objective data. I mean, you notice that on Doncitron, which is one of the drugs that he has studied and shown that it is safe in lactating women, very little gets to the baby. That's one of the biggest drugs that was in Yanita's chart. So connecting concrete data on safety with the providers who are prescribing those medications will be essential. But you've got to use those data to inform providers who are very concerned about liability issues. And that also, we didn't address that today, but that is something that came up over and over again with the industry members of the task force. So I think that's also going to be an issue when it comes to developing new therapeutics.
Yeah, I agree with what Diana just said. I would say that I also think there's, you mentioned the liability. There's also considerations around recruitment. We talked about awareness and outreach. I mean, I think there's a misperception that pregnant and lactating individuals should not be in research, and that needs to be dispelled. I mean, obviously, we need you need the data to support their inclusion, and there's work in the preclinical space that needs to be done, but broader awareness about the need for this information and getting it out there. I think there's practitioners in the communities where patients are that do not know that registries exist. There are people that have to take medications because they are pregnant and have to live with other conditions in their lives. And these are opportunities for us to gather that information. So to me, in addition to what Diana said, I think those would be some of the issues. Within FDA, there's a lot of support. I think I mentioned many of those efforts in my talk about moving the needle forward in this space.
Yeah, and then kind of to latch on to what Kavita said, for us, it's also kind of representation in our data sets, in the post-marketing real-world setting. It's so important to have a representative sample. in the data that we use for our work. And so that is why we start with population-based, but we're also working really hard to make sure that all parts of the community feel like they can and should participate in the kind of research that we do as well, just to make sure that we can say something about everybody included.
Thank you all. I'm going to turn over to some audience questions. Dr. Vashish, there are a couple of questions for you pertaining to when we might expect FDA to finalize the 2022 proposed rule that would harmonize the agency with the common rule, removing pregnant people as a vulnerable population.
Well, I believe the comment period just ended in December of 2022, and I know the agency is working as expeditiously as possible to review the comments that we've received. So at this time, I can't give you a definitive date, but we know it's important and we're working on reviewing the comments. And I think as there's new information that will be made available.
Great. And Dr. Bianchi, we had a question for you, whether you could give a sense of the number of NICHD funded studies on pharmacology and pregnancy that are conducted in the US, kind of compared to those types of studies that are conducted at sites abroad.
Well, off the top of my head, I can't give you, a number. We have thousands of studies, but our major overseas studies are conducted either through the global research network that I mentioned that did the A+ study. And we also fund quite a lot of research on HIV/AIDS. And so that we have pregnant lactating people taking medications against that are keeping HIV at low levels. But we also have the maternal fetal medicine units network. We fund a lot of R01s. I'm going to give a very rough estimate of about maybe 80-20, 80 domestic, 20 international in terms of percentages. But I can, if the person who asked the question wants to send me an email, I can get them a very precise answer.
Thank you. And looking at the time, I recognize we only have a couple minutes left. So PRGLAC is really what brought us here. So as you think about PRGLAC, if something like PRGLAC were to continue, or if it were to be more sustained, would that be helpful to each of you at your agencies and institutions? If so, how might that be helpful?
When you say be sustained, you mean the task force?
Yeah, the task force. Yeah.
So I think what's been very helpful, and I do want to thank everyone for this, is, first of all, the great interest from the community and the fact that we are being called to account for our activities in a number of different venues. To me, that's almost more important than having more task force meetings, because we need to be held accountable for how we are implementing the recommendations. And that's what's going to make a big difference between a white paper that sits on a shelf versus something that really makes change. So, I know that the National Academies, for example, held a meeting on several topics related to PRGLAC. I know that there's been congressional interest. I think that's what we need. So I'm making a plea to everybody listening to continue to ask us for what we're doing to make the recommendations viable and really contribute to changing the culture.
Lindsay, I just want to add one quick thing. I think one thing that PRGLAC highlighted is this is a multidisciplinary effort. And there's a responsibility on all of us, whether you're regulatory, academia, in the public, advocacy, to recognize this as these gaps as a critical public health matter, and that we all play a role. So I think, to me, that was one of the highlights of PRGLAC, is emphasizing that there needs to be this multidisciplinary effort.
And if I can add one last thing, I was just recently struck as we were talking about folic acid and its importance in preventing neural tube defects. I was like, but doesn't everybody know that? But what I keep forgetting is that the cohort of pregnant women is new over and over and over again. So I think a lot of the messages that we're putting out there, we have to keep putting out there. And I think that PRGLAC is a great venue to kind of move that forward and to keep reminding us that this is really important.
Well, I don't think we could have wrapped that up any more nicely than we just did. I would like to thank each of you again for contributing your time and your expertise to this discussion. You all are such important players in this work. And I would like to thank all of our attendees for joining us today for this important conversation. As I mentioned at the top of the webinar, this is one of a 3-part series. So the recordings for the other 2 briefings are available, as this one will be, and posted online. So we encourage you to check those out to really view this in a comprehensive way and to dive deeper into the areas surrounding the inclusion of pregnant and lactating populations and research. So again, I would like to thank our panelists for their time, and we look forward to continuing this important work with you and advocating for change to really move the needle forward here. So thank you for all you do.
Thank you for having us, and thanks for your advocacy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.